This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Abby Lucas.
We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of creativity.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
On each episode, we examine the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
We aren't. Find us online at artofdarkpod.com, and please support the show through Patreon or Substack. Thank you. We're back with another episode of Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. I'm Kevin Kautzman, coming to you from beautiful, frigid St. Paul, Minnesota, joined by my partner in crime. There it is, Abby in paradise right now, still.
Yes, this is the final episode for this trip, at least, from Art of Darkness South.
Art of Darkness Studios South in New Zealand. And this is a darkroom episode, so we have some guests lined up for you. I'll have to confess these are the first guests that Abby has brought into the fold. So welcome to the podcast party circuit, fellas. I think it's going to be very clear what we're talking about and who we're talking about. Well, maybe clear, maybe not. I mean, are we talking about Edward de Vere? Or are we talking about the man from Stratford? Regardless, we'll be talking about the man and the work of the man known as Willy Shakes, William Shakespeare, with these new friends on the pod. So, Abby, do you care to introduce the fellows we have joining us today?
Yes, this is my good friends, Brandon Weis and Blake Ellis, who were so kind to take me over to Fresno, California last year to direct a film called Reconsolidation, which the two of them wrote together. They're both multi-hyphenates and very talented people. And they have a new Shakespeare company out in Fresno, California called Chanticleer Shakespeare Company. I am going to let them talk about that for themselves because they will introduce it much better than I do. So take it away, guys.
Well, thank you so much. It was a joy having you out here in Fresno, of all places. I mean, some people view Fresno through a little bit of a dimmed glass, but I think the magic of being in sort of the crook of California is that you end up being California's best kept secret, and there's a lot that is going on here, a lot that's growing here, aside from agriculture. That is very exciting, especially to artsy people like ourselves. The joy that we had in bringing Abby out to direct the film that it took Brandon and I and our writing partner Mike Oldham close to a decade to get.
8 years.
Yeah, 8 years. Yeah.
8 years.
Yeah, it took a long time, went through a lot of iterations, and we could not have been happier with the outcome. It really it blew my socks all the way off. It was impressive.
It feels like a bit of a full circle moment for me because the first time I read the script for Reconsolidation, I was here in New Zealand.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah. I would like to extend my deepest heartfelt appreciation for you sticking with the project even after that first draft, because it was not great.
There's a reason why it had to go through so many rewrites, but I think what we ended up with was something that it distilled a lot of the spirit of what that first draft had and turned it into something that still reads and plays well. And I think your work really amplified that to a degree that we couldn't have expected, and it was fantastic. To sort of piggyback on what you were saying about, we're talking about the work of William Shakespeare that we're also passionate about. We founded a Shakespeare Company, a classical theater in Fresno, and it is the first professional Shakespeare Company in Fresno's history. I guess for the last maybe 100 years, there's been a lot of theater coming in and out of Fresno. Fresno used to be sort of like a regular stop for touring theaters. There's tons of buildings in the downtown Fresno area that used to be professional theater houses and were eventually sort of transformed into movie houses. And we are lucky enough to be partnering with one of the only remaining Pantages theaters in America. And it's the historic Warner's Theater in Fresno, California. And it's an absolutely beautiful space. And when you walk in, the first thing that strikes you, at least the first thing that struck me, was that of course we should be doing Shakespeare here. The place is gorgeous. But all of that to say, it's a very exciting new page for theater in Fresno, and it's putting us on the map already in terms of the submissions from actors we've gotten all over the country. There's people from New York City, there's people from San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, all over the place who want to come to Fresno to do some Shakespeare. And that is something that's never happened before, and it's very exciting. There's a lot of momentum behind it.
Well, so to sort of set up the episode we're going to do here, before we even say another word, where can people find the company online? Hit the plug.
Yeah, it's at chanticleershakes.com. And Chanticleer is spelled Chant, as in chant, but it is an alliteration with Shakespeare. So Chanticleer Shakespeare. Chanticleershakes.com is the website. You can also find us on Instagram at Chanticleer Shakespeare Co. And we've got a LinkedIn and a Facebook and all that. But if you type it into Google, we're pretty much the first people to show up.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to start getting right into the questions. And Abby, if you want to jump into, just, give me the high sign.
Sure.
But I have so many questions. You met each other on a film project, but now you're working on a Shakespeare Company. When did the idea for the Shakespeare Company start? Yeah.
Well, Brandon and I have known each other for more years than I can even count. We've
Or
known
want
each
to
other
admit.
since- Oh yeah. Or we'd like to admit for sure. We were friends in my early college days when we first got to know each other and worked together as actors in and out of class in college. And as life goes on, you end up going sort of different ways. My journey took me to first into the theater world and then into film and television, and then ended up bringing me back to Fresno. But I have family in Fresno, and I'll always have a connection to this community, and so I'll always end up coming back. It's like a boomerang. You keep ending up back in the same spot. But the wonderful thing about that is that you make these lifelong relationships, like the one I have with Brandon. He's been such an inspiration in terms of getting things done in a way I can't do. I mean, I'm mostly an artistic person, whereas I think I don't have the capability of executing all of the business side of things the way he does. He's got an excellent mind for that. And we started working on Chanticleer Shakes after I asked him to come and be our executive director. I had founded this company with a friend of mine, Brandy Martin, who is a fantastic lighting designer and theater professional in her own right. She's an educator, and she kind of gave me the nudge to start the ball rolling for the company. And it quickly got to the point where I realized there were things I could not do, things that just didn't have the know-how to execute. And I remember talking to Brandon saying, like, listen, this is going to be big. I've got a feeling that it's going to get huge, and I need you to come and help me. And I knew he was the best man for the job when the first reaction he had was, let me think about it. He didn't immediately jump on board. And I knew he was going to weigh every decision that he made throughout the rest of the company with the same kind of thoughtfulness. And that's really proven to be true.
One of my favorite things about theater as an artistic practice is that if you try to do it all yourself, you will be quickly humbled. Mm-hmm. And so it is an exercise in collaboration in almost every iteration of theater. So for these episodes, I like to give a little shape to them because we try to focus on the figure. Obviously, I'm excited to get to know the two of you, and Brandon, I want to hear, a little from you too, of course. But I found that the Poetry Foundation has these really, really nice, succinct biographies. So for the people who maybe missed our epic doubleheader with De Vere and Shakespeare, here's just a real quick recap. I'm going to read like 2 or 3 paragraphs of this. And on the After Dark for patrons, we're going to read from David Lynch's Catching the Big Fish, because it is the year of Lynch. Then we're going to read some Shakespeare poetry. And then I also have for the After Dark, I have an interesting article from the Globe about violence in Shakespeare's work. So we'll touch on that behind the paywall after the main episode here. But in any case, let me read a few paras here. This is from the Poetry Foundation. So while William Shakespeare's reputation is based primarily on his plays, he became famous first as a poet. With the partial exception of the sonnets, 1609, quarried since the 19th century for autobiographical secrets allegedly encoded in them, the non-dramatic writings have traditionally been pushed to the margins of the Shakespeare industry. That's a bit snide, the Shakespeare industry, please. Yet, but I guess that is what it is, right? I mean, we're all familiar with Slings and Arrows, of course. I'm sure the great Canadian series, yeah. Yet the study of his non-dramatic poetry can illuminate Shakespeare's activities as a poet, emphatically of his own age, especially in the period of extraordinary literary ferment in the last 10 or 12 years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. A little bit more here. His exact birth date remains unknown. He was baptized in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon on April 26, 1564. His mother's third child, but the first to survive infancy. This has led scholars to conjecture that he was born on April 23rd, given the era's convention of baptizing newborns on their third day. His father, John Shakespeare, moved to Stratford in about 1552 and rapidly became a prominent figure in the town's business and politics. He rose to be bailiff, the highest official in the town, but then in about 1575 or 76, his prosperity declined markedly and he withdrew from public life. In 1596, thanks to his son's success and persistence, he was granted a coat of arms by the College of Arms, and the family moved into New Place, the grandest house in Stratford, and so forth. Okay, there's more about this speculation that he traveled, worked as a schoolmaster in the country, was a soldier and a law clerk, or embraced or left the Roman Catholic Church, continues to fill the gaps left in the sparse records of the so-called lost years. And we went into all this on the core episodes. I just wanted to sort of load that up as a way to sort of start the conversation. So I'm going to dovetail really elegantly into a question. Brandon, Blake, what drew you to Shakespeare and what keeps you coming back? I know we take it for granted, but I want to know why we keep doing him, especially in America, especially in the far west coast of America, where Donnie's ashes from the end of The Big Lebowski keep blowing back into our faces, right? Out west. Like, why, for the skeptics, okay? Why this man? And maybe I'll throw that to you, Brandon, to sort of let you come on in.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the most exciting thing about Shakespeare and the thing that makes him so prevalent still today is that it's timeless. Every story that he's telling is timeless, and it can fit into any time frame, any political climate, whatever it's going to be. It just fits, and it can have a strong impact on its viewers, regardless of what their ideologies are. And I love that it's universal that way, that it's not alienating any part of its audience or any part of its players. Anybody can come and do this and find their own character in the characters or story within the story, because it is so timeless. I think the other thing is there's this idea that Shakespeare's like this elevated voice, and it really isn't. I mean, he wrote so brilliantly for both the commoners as well as the aristocrats within the society. And because of that, any individual can find their own voice in Shakespeare. And I think that that's pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm. I think
how much of... Oh, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Blake.
I was just going to say, I think there's a common thread amongst, Brandon and I both started out as actors, and I think the draw or the magnetism that Shakespeare's work has on actors is so palpable because it is an iteration of a reality we all live that is slightly higher than one will actually ever be able to live. The magnitude of the things you must feel and experience on stage in the moment while speaking a poetry that you don't normally speak in is such a strong demand on an actor. It forces you to call upon all of your faculties to deliver a performance that is not only believable, but is also elevated to a point where your performance is in itself a poetry. You have to match the poetry of the text, and it's a very difficult thing to master. And you look at all these actors, who have had immense success in film and television or even on stage, and the thing they all want to do in the twilight of their career is, I have to go and master Shakespeare. This is something I have to do. Look at what Denzel Washington's doing now.
Again, yeah.
Yeah, he's basically said, if there's anything I want to do, it's Shakespeare. So he's going to do, obviously Othello on Broadway with Jake Gyllenhaal, and it's like he could do anything, but he's choosing Shakespeare. Well, and there's a reason why. It's because it demands you bring everything you have and dump it all on the stage in a steaming pile of viscera, and that's how Shakespeare wrote it. And I think there's a lot of folks who look at it and say, this is too difficult. And I'm not going to fault those folks because it is very difficult. But when you find these actors who are striving to deliver the best that they absolutely can, the thing that pulls it out of them is Shakespeare.
Well, and I saw an interview with Denzel talking about exactly that. And one of the things that he had alluded to is the fact that he's played this character multiple times now in his life. And he needed to do it again because there were new experiences that he had that are going to influence the way that the material is seen in a new, fresh way. And I love that about Shakespeare more than any other playwright is your life experience. If you go back to a play that you haven't read in a while, and then you reread it through a new lens of life experience, it unlocks so much that wasn't there before. And I love that at, what is he, 60 now? He's diving back into this character just head first, and that's pretty amazing.
He's the reason to see Gladiator 2. I'll say that. Not a great film, but a passable sequel. I'll say that much. So this question that sprung to mind as you were speaking, Brandon, dovetails pretty nicely into the other question that I had, but I want to say, Blake, that insight from the actor's perspective it's something I've never heard articulated before. I've tried acting. I'm not an actor. I'm a playwright. One thing I do tell playwrights is you have to go and try to act. You have to go and take an acting lesson because that's who you're writing for. You wouldn't sort of write a symphony without knowing how to play an instrument. Maybe you would, but you're making it harder on yourself. The first people you have to sell if you're writing a play are the actors who are going to do it. If you could sell the actors, then your money, because they're the ones who are going to do it. So it was just a tremendous insight. So I really appreciate that. Abby, good job. Bringing on these guys. I'm enjoying it already. But the thing that was coming to my mind is this sort of like universality of Shakespeare and the timelessness of it. Brandon, how much of that do you think is down to the fact, obviously genius, but down to the fact that human nature doesn't change and power politics don't change? And do you think that's fair and real? I mean, or is that too pat and too cliche?
No, I think that there is some validity to that. And I think that there's a reality that life is cyclical and things come back around. And no matter what the situation is or what the story is, I think in any walk of life, whether it's like a lot of my life I've spent in the corporate world, there are people that have ambitions where they are willing to step on anyone and everyone to get to the job that they want to get to. And I see those mirrored in Shakespeare's works. So I have a different business connection to the play automatically that gives me a different perspective than some other people wouldn't have. And so I think that's it is very real. It comes back around and around and around. And that's the great thing about Shakespeare.
I spend way too much time on Twitter famously. And just this weekend, the discourse is around Elon Musk's concubines. I mean, this is like something. It's like something out of Greek drama or out of Shakespeare. Another just a real random thought that I had now is that, Shakespeare's writing, is so influenced by the classics and also sort of biblical narrative, that world. They were much closer to that. They were much more immersed in that. So there's this sense of gravitas and heft and kind of like intertextual stuff going on where, I'm sure as an actor, you can be sitting there with a lexicon and references and going, oh gosh, he's talking about astrology here. And then that connects to something else in the play. It really keeps you on your toes. So I guess this will be a question, and I'll throw this back over to Blake here now. But I mean, Abby, just jump in anytime. But
Sure.
so like, what are the themes in Shakespeare that you think, like, playing this in front of modern audiences, playing this in front of people out in California, like what resonates with folks most in the work? And are there particular plays that kind of hit harder than others?
Our upcoming production, I think, is going to hit pretty hard. We're doing a rather ambitious cutting of Richard III, which I think is one of his finest pieces of work. It's funny, it's violent, it's very dark. It gives you such a unique insight into the sacrifices people make to appease powerful people around them, thinking that they can save themselves. And it also gives you a unique perspective into the lengths people will go to achieve the thing that they think that they are owed. It's a fantastic play, even when you're doing the 2 hour 45-minute version of it. But one of the things that we set out to do when we decided to do this was to cut this script into something that was digestible for a modern audience. What we have affectionately referred to as the TikTok audience, there's an element of a cinematic element that must be present in live theater now to hook an audience that is used to digesting things in 15-second reels. And one of the challenges was figuring out a way to take a play like Richard III and build it in a way that the scenes move like a freight train, and that there's no time to slow down. There's no intermission for people to get out and digest the first half and then come back or decide if they're gonna come back. One of the images that we've used to talk about how this show should feel is it should feel like the play grabbed the audience by the throat and held them in their chair for 90 minutes until the bloody finale. That's what it should feel like. And I feel like if you can get Shakespeare's work into the hands of competent actors who understand the text and understand the engine of the poetry and how it drives that material all the way to the end of the emotional arc for every character, when you finally get to the end of that play, people should be exhausted, but they should understand what happened. They shouldn't feel like they ate their vegetables. Does that make sense? Oftentimes, going to see classical theater feels like a chore.
Yep. Oh, just theater, full stop.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of our goals is to make this something that is fresh and new and exciting, not just for people who have been fans of live theater and live classical theater, but for a whole new audience of people who generally wouldn't have even stepped foot into see a live theater show. I want them to feel like this is special because I was in the room when all these things were happening on stage. The people were right in front of me. I understood this poetry, this language that people said I wouldn't understand, but I did understand it. And I want to, find a way to light that fire in a new audience for a hunger for classical theater, because I think there's so much of it that is unmined, especially in young people today. I would love to see more people be excited about things like this.
How did you go about the process of cutting it down? Because it seems like such a daunting task. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Did you do it initially alone or in collaboration with the performers?
No, I'm very close to this material. I've done this show before, and I have, for at least the last 15 years, wanted to do a production of this that was cut down. And that's not to say that I have, any sort of distaste for anything that's in the play. I think the play, like uncut, is brilliant, but it's just not digestible. Not easily digestible, I should say. The cutting process began with sort of figuring out what an audience would need out of a play like this, what they would need out of a production of doing a Shakespearean play today. And I think one of the biggest pieces was, how do we make this feel as cinematic as possible? How do we make the scenes feel like, Shakespeare's famous for this, showing up late and getting out early. I think if if you start trimming those scenes in a way that fits with the poetry he's already given you, that fits with the momentum of a scene moving into the next, I think a lot of the cuts that we've made are sort of intuitive. And I spent, I guess probably say the better part of a year hemming and hawing over it, and eventually came down with a cutting that if staged the way I think we're going to end up staging it, this should run at about 90 minutes, which is an absolute freight train. It should feel like an Indy car.
The one thing that I want to toss in there that I think is important from an actor perspective, as well as somebody who's running the business portion of the company too, is I appreciate so much the effort that was put into the edit of the script. Because it came from a place of absolute respect for what we're going to call William Shakespeare for now, right? But absolute respect for William Shakespeare and the works. There was careful intentionality around not marring any of the verse. And I think that specificity coming from an actor perspective and a playwright perspective that Blake is really served the material well. And knowing that we wanted to go at it through this cinematic lens, he was able to make some really sharp cuts that would make great transitions that are just like you would see in a film like in Reconsolidation. So I just want to throw those kudos out because Blake did an exceptional job with this cutting.
And this is happening in June, it looks like, and directed by Brad Myers. Blake, what are you? So are you acting in this?
Yeah, I'll be playing Richard.
Well, there you are. Okay, there it is. Yeah, fair enough. Sure. Are you familiar? You're familiar with the great Withnell and I, the great film Withnell and I?
No, I haven't.
There comes a time in a young man's life when he wakes up one day and realizes he will never play the Dane. It's a very famous line. No, but that's great. So what is your, well, this is a natural, and if you don't know Withnell and I, by the way, it's a UK classic. It's sort of like their Lebowski. They quote it all the time. It's a theater people movie. You absolutely have to see it. I think George Harrison co-produced it, so there's some Beatles music in it and everything. Yeah, it's a little hard to find, which is dumb. There's in any event. So June 2025 at chanticleershakes.com. I'm going to have a question here in a little bit that sort of opens it up for people who maybe aren't in Fresno, or maybe people who you can't find Shakespeare locally. I always like to sort of think about people who maybe don't have that access. But first, I want to ask, how are you preparing as an actor?
Oh man, like I said, I've been sort of living with this for years. But the preparation for me has been I've been wearing a lot of hats as the artistic director of the company in terms of building everything and the momentum toward this particular show, wrangling the team that we've been able to put together and finding the best talent that we can possibly bring together in terms of like our scenic design, and our lighting designer Brandy Martin is going to be bringing her expertise to bear on the stage. A lot of those hats have been sort of like coming on and off of the top of my head, and the one that I think I'm dreading maybe that's the wrong word, but I do feel like a certain amount of trepidation is the one where I have to really dive into who the character is. There are some roles that allow me to make small incremental changes leading up to a production. To give you an example, I did a production of Lieutenant of Inishmore in Berkeley, California, many years ago now, and it required a very specific Irish dialect, which I was not very comfortable with, and so I just decided to adopt it 24/7 and made everyone around me insane. And so it was definitely a piece of the puzzle for preparing for that role. This role doesn't require things like that. I'm not going to walk with a limp for 6 months, but there is some character analysis that I've been sort of wading into, and I think one of the pivotal pieces of that is finding the why. I had a conversation with someone about this character, and they were saying, well, I've always seen this character as just sort of like psychopathic and someone who just sort of has absolutely no empathy. I said, well, I don't know that that's playable I think it's very difficult to play a character that has zero empathy.
It's not interesting, at least.
Well, yes,
No.
it wouldn't be very compelling. My goal is to find a way for an audience to see Richard do the things he does, and then turn to the audience and share the joy of the things he's doing with them, and for them to find themselves thinking, would I do that in that situation? Could this be me? What in myself am I seeing in Richard? And that's obviously going to be a very tall order, but the preparation for something like that is diving into who that can be as a person. And I don't think the solution to that is finding out who he actually was in history, because that's different than who Shakespeare wrote.
It seems to me that it must be a really extraordinary challenge because you're playing a king, and we live in a time where we're just about as far away from the time of kings as you could be. Like the past 500 years of history have literally been about getting as far away from that as possible. And you're out in California, you're an American. So how are you finding putting on the mantle of a man who believes he's divinely ordained to rule and have responsibility over? I mean, I feel this way as a podcaster. All our listeners, I feel very, gentle toward them,
You're divinely ordained to
Noblesse oblige, to blather into a microphone until people get sick of me and turn it off. No, but really, that I promise that was a question. Like, sort of, how are you finding that? And and there's some discourse right now around monarchy and how maybe we're not as far away from monarchy as we think we are. Things like the New York Times being a hereditary. It's run by the same family generation by generation, and they have an extraordinary amount of power. So how is that really that different from something from the 15th century? So I guess I'm asking you, what are you finding kind of emotionally when you think about, I'm going to be the king on stage?
Well, I think it's important to know that he is only king from about, Act 3 on. When we find him, what we really find is at the beginning of Richard III, we meet a character who we have also seen through Henry VI, part 1, 2, and 3. And this is a guy who has systematically been positioning himself, not because he believes he's divinely ordained, but because that's what I want. There's a line from Henry VI 3, I believe, where Richard is speaking to the audience, and he says, "We'll say there is no kingdom then for Richard. What other pleasure can the world afford?" The idea that, like, if I'm not going to have a kingdom, what good is life? That's what I want. I'm not going to rest until I get that. And I think that's something, that ambition that is in the human psyche, like, people can identify with that. And now it's about what lengths do you go to achieve the thing you want. And this is why I think it's interesting to see a character like Richard do things that are evil. They're outright evil. And he tells you what he's going to do. I'm going to go do this evil thing. And then does it. And then turns back to the audience and says, wasn't that awesome? Like, he's a delicious villain. And I think the interesting thing about the play as a whole, and I've made sure to keep this in the cutting, is that his relationship with the audience is very convivial in the opening and stays that way for a while with his soliloquies to the audience. But as he gains power and the level of chaos around him begins to go up, his relationship with the audience diminishes, and he's not able to reach out to them anymore. There's, you've got several soliloquies where he's looking at them saying, like, aren't I fantastic? Everybody thinks that, I've bamboozled everybody, and I'm going to get what I want. And as he begins to get the things he wants, the world around him becomes more and more unstable. More and more people around him pose a threat, and so he has them executed. And he realizes at some point, I have nowhere else to turn. And even the audience, who is the person in the world of the play, who he can always rely on, they're no longer there for him either. And I think that's a really isolating and lonely world to live in. So I think that's why, it's ultimately a cautionary tale about how, like, unchecked ambition can put you into a place of absolute desolation.
That's such a modern thing to do. to have the relationship with the audience change as the character changes. It just sounds like something that you would do right now as a writer. So, of course, we're all sort of looking back to that. I want to throw this question over to Brandon, and I sort of hinted at this earlier. For people who are listening to this, and maybe we sort of sold them on Shakespeare, and they don't know where to start, and maybe they're listening to this late at night, and the regional theater isn't doing Midsummer until the spring, right? So, what are some examples of online or digital or film or other materials, even books and things? Do you have your favorites, like the Brana Hamlet or some of those, that people might be able to find?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think that while there is some bad Shakespeare out there, there's not bad references to look at. You're going to learn something from everything. And even in the quote unquote bad ones, there's great work being done in there if you're looking at it through the right lens. So I would say any connection to Shakespeare is going to be a winning connection to Shakespeare. I think the best thing that you can do is pick up a copy of complete works and just find a play that speaks to you and just start reading it. Once you start to put the words out of your mouth, it becomes your story too. And then you've got a connection to it that is different than any other human being is going to have a connection to it. So I think for me, that's kind of where I started as a young actor with Shakespeare, is just trying to put the words in my own body and in my own mouth. And there are some great pieces out there. Certainly, there's elements of Brana's Hamlet that I love. I went down a deep dive on Hamlet a while back, and there's 4 million different ways to be or not to be. And I don't know that I found one that I'm like, that's it. That was the win. But in every single one of them, I'm like, oh my God, that moment was so rich and beautiful. But then I liked so-and-so's version of that next line. So you kind of want to piecemeal it all together into what you think is the ultimate version of it. And then as an actor, I'm like, all right, well, how would I have done that differently? What kind of take would I have done if I take a little bit of Brana, a little bit of, what's the guy at the RSC that did it, Blake? We've watched this
there's
together.
A bunch of guys. There's
the most recent from the TV show.
Oh yeah. Now I'm blanking on his name from
Scott?
Fleabag.
Is it Scott?
He was in Fleabag, and he plays the priest.
Well, if you can get your hands on
Andrew Scott.
Andrew Scott, yes.
If you can get your hands on the RSC materials going all the way back, they don't miss, as you say. They wouldn't put something out that's unworthy, for sure.
I do think that there's an important distinction to be made between the RSC and the way they approached doing Shakespearean material in, let's say, the 70s and the 80s, and the things that sort of, across the Shakespearean world, the way they approach it now, it's definitely sort of taken a different tack. And I think they were focusing more on the poetry and the sort of the scansion and the mechanism of the poetry early on, and now it's become a little bit more focused on the emotional journey, because you have these two sensibilities, I should say, that oftentimes are at war with each other in playing Shakespearean text. And I think the hard part is finding a way to marry those together so that they support each other rather than fight against each other. One of the most interesting things, to piggyback on the question that you asked Brandon, and I know Brandon's seen this, and so I think he'll agree. There is a
RSC.
Well, no. I'm going to talk about the Playing Shakespeare series that was done. It must have been in the mid '80s.
84.
You've got John Barton, who has basically collected a group of people who it's just all of the superstars from British theater royalty. You've got David Suchet and Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen and Judi Dench and everybody you can think of. And they're all in a room sitting there, obviously smoking cigarettes and talking about Shakespeare. But he had directed both David Suchet and Patrick Stewart, both in the role of Shylock in different productions. And they were wildly different interpretations of the character. And so there is an episode of Playing Shakespeare where he has David Suchet and Patrick Stewart each play Shylock in a scene with the other actor reading the other parts. And so you get to see them and how their interpretations are different. And it's mind-blowing how good it is, because either interpretation is valid, it's anchored in the text, it's anchored in informed choices based on the text, and there's zero part of an agenda forced onto the play. It's just, here's the play Shakespeare wrote to the best of my ability. And that's really inspiring as an actor, because you find out how much work he actually already did for you. That's special.
It's mind-boggling to think about just the synergy in that room too, with that pool of actors. My goodness.
Well, another question here, as we sort of come into the back nine of the main part of this episode. You've spoken to this a little bit already, Blake, but what are the biggest challenges staging this work for a contemporary audience? Let's say particularly in Fresno, but I think, right, we're all Californians now, in a sense. So, do you know, although you gentlemen have better tans than I do. I'm in the weeds right now out here in Minnesota. It's rough out here right now, let me tell you. But I guess, what are the challenges you face? Of course, attention spans, all the rest, but could you speak a little more about that, Blake?
Oh yeah, sure. I think there's a tendency in American theater, and it's not just West Coast American theater, it's all over, to turn Shakespeare's work into something that is sort of anchored in a current event, or anchored in some sort of a soapbox moment for a director, or someone saying, like, this is my personal cause, and I'm going to take this version of Much Ado About Nothing and say this about the world. And it's like, for me, I think there's a lot of fatigue for audiences when they see productions like that, because it's just been done so often. And it's like, okay, well, I'm seeing a production of Midsummer. What is this going to tell me I'm doing wrong? And I think the refreshing side of at least our approach to how we're handling Shakespeare at Chanticleer is that we want to do the play Shakespeare wrote. I mean, to the best of our ability. The cutting, notwithstanding, obviously, because we're trying to make it still digestible. And I think one day we'll end up getting to the point where we can do a play in its entirety. And I think our audiences will be conditioned to expect it and to appreciate it. But, as we're starting out, I think one of the most difficult challenges was finding a way to do Shakespeare that people don't roll their eyes at. And, the idea initially of, like, we're going to do we're starting a Shakespeare company. What's the show we should do? We spent a lot of time thinking about, what would be the right choice. Everybody is saying, well, you got to start with a big splashy comedy, and those are expensive and oftentimes require twins. So you got to have the right actors. But you got to have some people who can pass. But the thing that we sort of like landed on was finding a play that had comedy and had drama and betrayal and action. It had some good fight scenes. It had some really powerful poetry in it, and a pacing that people could get on board with and feel at home sitting and watching it. And, when we were thinking about what are the most popular things that we've seen in the last, decade and a half, House of Cards, Game of Thrones, The Penguin most recently, what do all these Sopranos, they've got this undeniable engine behind them, and these larger than life characters, and almost a heightened reality they live in. And when you put all those things together and say, like, any of these things can be boxes that are checked by a lot of Shakespeare plays, but I think Richard is one that I think is going to fit the bill for a lot of folks, and is, to your point, is going to be staged in a way that doesn't allow people to catch their breath. Because I think there's who said this? I think Billy Wilder said this. I think you can be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes ahead of your audience, but if they get 2 seconds in front of you, you're dead.
Yeah.
And I want audiences to feel like they are constantly trying to catch up with where we're going.
Right.
And so that's the goal, at least with this particular production. But Shakespeare as a whole, I think staging Shakespeare is always going to be a challenge to make it interesting and exciting. But I think the most exciting thing now, to me at least, and to a lot of people I've spoken with in the professional world, is doing the play the way Shakespeare wrote it, as opposed to making it something it's not.
I did a lot of high school Shakespeare festivals in small town New Zealand. And you'd have to do sort of like 15 minutes of a play. And quite often you'd pick a monologue or just like a scene or something like this. And it more often than not, it seemed to be a competition of who has the most inventive way of reimagining this work. And there was one that I did, and I only have myself to blame because I'm the one who came up with the idea. I was about 16 or 17. We staged, I think it was Kate's final monologue from Taming of the Shrew. And there were three of us, and we performed it as cats. And we were all in cat suits, and we had like a kitten and an older cat and a middle cat, and we had a human-sized like cat tree that we were all like climbing up sort of thing. And I was explaining this to someone the other day, and they were like, "What on earth were you doing?" And like, why couldn't we just perform the play? Like, performing Shakespeare wasn't good enough. We had to.
Well, there's two things. There has to be video of this somewhere.
I know.
I was going to say I'd
I'd
pay a certain amount of cryptocurrency to see that video.
Yes. No, but I think you're right. And I think that play in particular is one that has sort of fallen victim to this. And I think it's because of the subject matter. It's not palatable to some people who feel that it flies in the face of whatever their particular worldview is. But you got to remember that these plays are written a certain number of years ago, and they're still being done. And I think the angle of making a play into something it's not because the modern audience won't like it or won't like the subject matter is different than making a play into something that is more readily digestible for what it is. And I think that's the difference between what we're doing at Chanticleer and what I've seen done in a lot of theaters where I've worked, a lot of theaters that I've gone and supported across the country, is that there's been this sort of idea that you can change Shakespeare's work into something that fits a trend or a hot button issue or something that somehow that's going to serve you well, whereas his plays being done the way they were written for hundreds of years has been pretty successful on its own. And I don't see, I mean, my dad used to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think this is one thing that I heard said, and Brandon was here when he was with me when I saw it said. It was by a really smart artistic director for a theater out in California, oddly enough. But he said, "You are not smarter than Shakespeare."
No, right, right,
and that could not be more true.
That is certainly true. Right. Well, let me ask one more question here of Brandon, kind of as we come into the home stretch, and then we'll take a little break and then come back for the After Dark. I'll tease that before we break, Brett. But Brandon, you're putting in this work sort of behind the scenes and and all of that. So I guess I would ask is like, what do you hope the impact is locally? What do you hope you're just starting. I know, for example, in the Twin Cities here, we have the Guthrie. It's just this massive institution that started as a company. Mm-hmm. All of these institutions start somewhere. And I happen to believe right now that we need new institutions. We need parallel institutions. And you're starting one. And so I guess I would say, what are your hopes for the near term? And then what are your hopes for the long term for Chanticleer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate you asking that. I think ultimately, Fresno is it's poised for this moment, I think, too. But Fresno's the fifth largest city in the state, and we don't have a professional theater in our downtown core. And that's a problem.
Unacceptable.
It is completely. If you think about I think about San Diego, Blake and I talk about the old Globe down there. The city owns that theater. They take a pride and ownership of that. And nothing like that exists here in the Central Valley. There is not a professional house within 150 miles of Fresno, right here in the center of the state. And that's not okay. And so our goal is to create that central hub here in the city of Fresno, in the city that Blake and I both grew up in. And the other side piece of our mission is that in Fresno, because there has not been a professional house for actors to go and learn and train and continue to hone their craft, is to create an environment where there is a place for them to do that. For Blake and I, when we were done with college, we had no choice but to go outside of Fresno and take our talents there. Our goal is to be able to keep local talent here working on their craft, strengthening the artistic core of what Fresno can be. And so it's very much twofold that way, because we also want to bring in great talent and show everyone what equity talent can do here in Fresno, and help create this environment where we're just raising all of the talent in the city. It's going to bleed into the community theaters. It's going to bleed into the schools. It's going to have a huge, massive impact on the city of Fresno. Not only that, but we've strategically placed ourselves right in downtown. And the Fresno downtown area has been on a rebuild process for years, and making people feel compelled to go into the downtown area. And this is one more thing that is going to be an invitation to the city, to the valley, for 150 miles on each side. Come to Fresno. Come and spend your weekend here. Come and spend your dollars here. Come and go to a restaurant, all the things. And come and see legitimately one of the most spectacular theaters I've ever stepped foot in. It was built in 1928, and it is just absolutely stunning. And they have a new artistic or executive director there at the Warner Center for the Performing Arts, and they are starting their capital funding right now as well. So they are building up that theater for a renovation process, and we're shoulder to shoulder with them in that. And they've embraced us in such a way to where they call the Warners the home of Chanticleer Shakes, which for me, that kind of, it's a little feather in our cap for sure. But I also feel part of the bigger picture of what the downtown revitalization is going to be, which matches our mayor's goal of One Fresno and bringing people back to the Central Valley. Yeah, I think that's big picture kind of what I'm looking at. And then I just wanted to toss in one of the core foundational things of our company. And Blake and I and Brandy have talked a lot about this, that we are a company of no egos. Which sounds odd for actors to say, because I think we're all a little bit driven by ego a little. But we're not a company of egos. The best idea in the room wins. And that may not be my idea or Blake's idea or Brandy's idea. But in that, I think there's a lot of power. And Blake says this perfectly. The only diva in the room is Shakespeare. That's the only one that gets to have that ego because he's earned it. And I think there's so much strength and power to that concept as a team, where we can check each other without being afraid of what is this going to be the impact or anything like that. We can help each other towards that best path. And I love the relationship that we've built. Everybody that we brought on, we've kind of shared that same mentality of hey, this is how we're going to operate. So if you want to be part of this, you need to understand that this is our core. This is who we are. And I think it's going to build something really special here in the Central Valley.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll wind down here now, but Blake, any thoughts on that? And we'll kind of let you get the last word before I tease the after dark, and we'll take a quick break.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that Brandon was saying. Our mission initially was, to build a professional venue here in the Valley, not just to bring in outside talent from places like New York or San Francisco, wherever they might be from, but to create a launch pad for local talent. We've had so many super talented people come up through the educational system in the greater Central Valley, only to realize that they've reached the top of where they can go and they have to go somewhere else. And they end up blessing some other community who has invested their own resources into building a venue. And those communities get to experience the talent and the personalities that this valley cultivated. And like Brandon says, putting those resources back into our own community and creating a venue here to keep that local talent local as long as they want to be, and to continue to bring artists from all over the country here. I mean, it's already becoming more of a magnet than I ever expected it would be. We've gotten submissions from everywhere, people who are saying like, "Oh, well, I'd love to come be a part of your inaugural show," and it's like, "Do you remember where Fresno is?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know." Well, yeah, and then
we got Abby here.
I know we got Abby out. But the exciting thing is that it's putting Fresno on the map in an entirely new way, and it is turning a page for theater in Fresno in an exciting new direction. I think all of the community theaters that have been around for decades and decades, who have been laying a foundation of quality community theater in the Valley, without their work for the past 50 some odd years, we wouldn't be able to be where we're at. So one of the things that Brandon has always said is we should never be ignoring our past, but we should be building on it. And the idea is we're not replacing these community theaters that will continue to exist. There's definitely going to be a place in the Valley for all the community theater that still exists here, because it's fantastic. Mm-hmm. But I think adding a professional theater to that ecosystem is the next step. And we're excited to be a part of that.
Great. All right. So no, really, that's very cool. I am in. I'm in a theater town, right? And I'm a theater guy, despite myself, So on the After Dark for patrons, we always ask for support for the podcast because these episodes don't make themselves. We don't. The guests just don't fall out of the sky. So please support us at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. If you want to hear another 20, 30 minutes with Blake, Brandon, Abby, and myself, we are going to read from David Lynch's Catching the Big Fish at random and see if there's any synchronicity. We'll see if the spirit of David Lynch continues to speak to us through the book, which has been happening. We're going to read a few of our favorite Shakespeare sonnets, and I'm going to ask Blake. Would you be willing to read some poems? Would you read a poem or two on the After Dark?
Well, I was not prepared for that, but maybe.
Well, just go. Well, so I'll read if you don't want to read, but you are the actor. But if you go to the Poetry Foundation, William Shakespeare, and maybe find one or two that strike you. The other alternative would be, I don't know if you have your script in front of you, but I would love to hear a soliloquy from Richard III behind the paywall. Okay, so that would be awesome. Yeah, I know how to put on a show. Right?
I've seen it. I've seen him do one of the soliloquies already. He reluctantly did it in front of me. It's worth
only. Okay, very good, very good. Only if you're comfortable, Blake. But I would certainly appreciate it. And then to kind of give shape to the After Dark, I've got this. I've got this business from the Globe, which of course is an august and important Shakespeare institution, and I've got an article called "These Violent Delights Have Violent Ends: Fights, Brawls, Feuds, and Duels in Romeo and Juliet and Elizabethan England" by Nina Romanchikova. And so we will read from that on the After Dark. Abby, thank you so much for bringing these new friends into the podcast party circuit. Blake, Brandon, really appreciate your time. And please, everybody, go to chanticleershakes.com. That's 2 E's in clear, especially if you're out in Fresno. I know we have California friends and listeners. We're friends with a podcast called Rare Candy, and I think they may kind of be out that way. So if you guys are listening, just definitely check this out. Put some butts in seats and go see the race car, the Speed Racer adaptation of Richard III in June at Chanticleer Shakes. We will be back. Brandon, Blake, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.